Right.
discussion.
Okay, so I will start. Good morning and good afternoon to all. Some morning for others and good afternoon to all. My name is Anthony Rosa, Secretary Treasurer of Teamsters Local 202, and also the Director of the HRDC, Human Rights and Diversity Commission. And I'd also like to welcome my Assistant Director, Mr. Ruben Torres, who's on the bottom. More importantly, I have my brother and my friend who I'd like to introduce, Mr. Eric Artisan, Teamster Professor of Modern American History from the George Washington University. My brother, thank you for coming and introducing our other friends. Thank you.
Absolutely, and thank you, Anthony. So it is my genuine pleasure to introduce and to welcome Joseph McCartin to this multicultural history seminar organized by the Teamsters Human Rights and Diversity Commission. Joe is a professor of history at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C. He's also the executive director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, based at Georgetown. He is first and foremost one of our leading labor historians. He is also a social and political historian as well, and he's a prolific scholar. His first book, Labor's Great War, The Struggle for Industrial Democracy and the Origins of Modern American Labor Relations, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 1998, and it won the Philip Taft Labor History Book Award the following year. His second book, Collision Course, Ronald Reagan, the Air Traffic Controllers, and the Strike That Changed America, was published by Oxford University Press in 2011 and received the Richard A. Lester Award for Outstanding Book on Industrial Relations and Labor Economics. And he's also co-author, along with Melvin Dubofsky, of Labor in America, A History, a book that covers, well, just about everything pertaining to its subject, both chronologically and thematically. And he's co-editor of What Works for Workers, Public Policies and Innovative Strategies for Low-Wage Workers, Americanism, New Perspectives on the History of an Ideal, and most recently, Purple Power, The History and Global Impact of SEIU. I won't begin to list where his articles have appeared. That would cut even more into his presentation time. But I'll just mention a few last things. Joe is vice president and soon to become president of the Labor and Working Class History Association, and he's currently working on a project that explores the twin crises of declining labor organization and diminishing democracy, tracing both the decline of collective bargaining in the United States and current efforts to reimagine and revive it. Today, he'll be speaking on recent history of considerable importance, from the 1981 PATCO strike to the 2023 UPS fight, the story of labor's loss, and its long struggle to regain the power of collective action. Joe, welcome to the Teamsters History Seminar. Really glad to have you here.
Oh, Eric, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I couldn't be happier to have an opportunity to talk to you Teamsters at such an important moment in history, about history. And so what I hope to do today is to give you a sense of, as Eric mentioned, some of our recent history and how it provides a backdrop to things that are going on right now. So let me go ahead and share my screen so I can show you some slides and get into this presentation. Does everybody see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
So what I want to talk about today is about an event that I've written about. That's a very important strike of more than 40 years ago now, the strike of air traffic controllers, who were members of a union called PATCO in 1981, and how that shaped the history that comes up to the present moment. I want to do that to provide a backdrop to what the Teamsters are now engaging in your negotiation with UPS. And this is a story about what PATCO did to take away from workers for so many years, the effective tool of withholding their labor, engaging in a strike, engaging in collective action. And what a devastating impact that 1981 strike had on workers' ability to do that, and how workers have been struggling since then to regain that power, which I think right now we're living through an important moment in that struggle. I don't need to tell anybody listening to me here about what's going on in your union right now. For months now, the union has been preparing for the negotiation it's now engaged in with the United Parcel Service. It's going to be one of the most important contract negotiations in the private sector in literally decades. And the importance of that negotiation is hard, I think, to overstate. Whatever happens in this negotiation, I think, is going to influence not only the broader parcel delivery industry in general, but what happens to private sector workers in so many parts of our economy. Now, one of the crucial things about the Teamsters as they're engaging in this negotiation is that they have a powerful historical memory behind them, and UPS has that memory as well. That's what happened in 1997, when one of the 10 largest strikes in American history took place, and the largest strike that has taken place since 1997. That was the walkout by Teamsters against UPS when contract negotiations failed in 1997. And in that walkout, 185,000 workers went on strike for 15 days. They went on strike demanding an end to the growth of part-time labor at that time. They made some great breakthroughs in that negotiation, and it had a profound impact for many years on the whole industry. UPS remembers that strike. Teamsters remember that strike. And knowing that Teamsters were able to do that they were able to have solidarity, walk out and demand and win a better settlement from the company in 1997 is one of the most important tools right now at that bargaining table. Everybody knows the Teamsters could strike if they have to, and that gives them real power, real leverage, and it will help to shape what happens in that negotiation. Now, it's all the more important that Teamsters have that memory, because in general, American workers as a whole do not. Because over the past half century, we've seen a dramatic decline in workers' ability to engage in strikes, especially successful strikes. Here you see a graph of statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the number of strikes each year in which at least 1,000 workers are engaged. And you can see from that graph that there was a plummeting in that number between 1977 and 1987. The collapse of workers' ability to engage in large-scale collective action in that period was devastating for the labor movement as a whole. And it left unions like the Teamsters in its 1997 strike sort of almost out there all alone as unions able to engage in successful strikes. What I want to talk to you about today is how that collapse came about, and particularly about the role of air traffic controllers and their failed 1981 strike in producing that collapse. And as Eric noted in introducing me, I've written about this subject, and I'll be drawing a lot from the book that I wrote on that strike and its impact. It's called Collision Course, Ronald Reagan, the Air Traffic Controllers, and the Strike That Changed America. And I do think it really had that kind of dramatic impact. I think it really changed industrial relations in the United States in a detrimental way, in a way that workers have been struggling to recover from almost ever since. And luckily, in which I think workers are beginning to recover from in recent years. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I want to focus on the 1981 air traffic controller strike, how it came about and what its impact was. Here you see some strikers in New York City in 1981, pictured there behind one of those "Don't Tread on Me" flags, which in recent years have come to, I think, represent more of the sort of right-wing kind of movement associated with what happened on January 6th. There were a number of those flags on display there. But in 1981, these controllers were saying this to the federal government, their employer, that they were demanding the right to negotiate over their pay and working conditions in a way that federal law did not allow for. Interestingly enough, I know that Teamsters have their horse logo with thunder and lightning on it. And earlier I had the picture up there of the chin strapped football helmets on the logo. PATCO also had its own horse logo, you see here in a button displayed then. They called their strike leaders horses. It's hard to imagine a more different group in some ways than the air traffic controllers in 1981 and the Teamsters today. One was a private sector group, the Teamsters with UPS. The other was public sector, air traffic controllers working for the federal government. One is a huge union. The Teamsters membership at UPS is over 300,000. PATCO's membership was tiny in comparison. Only about 11 to 12,000 workers took part in the walkout in 1981. And that was about 80% of the controller workforce. So one was public, one was private, one was tiny, one is large. Yet I do think in some ways that the history of what PATCO did and what's happening now with the Teamsters are two moments in a larger story about collective action in US history, workers' ability to engage in it, and whether they can do that effectively or not. And so I want to try to connect these two stories if I can in my time with you. In a sense, the theme of what I want to talk about is how everything is connected. And the struggles of a small public sector union affect more than those workers as they did in 1981, that what happened to PATCO there spilled well beyond government into the private sector and affected lots of different things. The labor movement has long had the motto, "An injury to one is the concern of all." That was on the emblem of the Knights of Labor, the big labor movement organization of the late 19th century. And in a sense, what we see here in the story I want to tell you is how things are connected and how even the struggles of that small union in 1981 are connected even to this day to what's going on in the Teamsters negotiation with UPS. So having said that, let me talk about PATCO and its origins. And really it had its origins in places like the one pictured here. These are two air traffic controllers. They worked for the Federal Aviation Administration in 1960 in a hangar. They were working in a hangar at then JFK, or then it was called Idlewild Airport. Now you know it as JFK. Hangar 11 was converted to a radar facility where people like this sat hunched over radar screens, like the one you can see that their hands are resting on there, following the blips of planes as they moved about and directing them. By the way, those screens they were working on, a lot of them were war surplus radar screens that came off of battleships. They were old, they were clunky, sometimes they failed. These workers were at the beginning of the jet age, learning how to move air traffic at a time when they were kind of inventing the profession that they were in. They were federal employees. Most of them were military veterans. They were overwhelmingly white and male at that time. I'm going to talk more about that later. And And they worked in a culture that really retained a kind of military sense of hierarchy and discipline. They were not really allowed to complain about the kind of equipment they worked on. They had no union rights to speak of. I'll say more about that in a second. And their work they found increasingly stressful, especially at the end of the 50s as jets started to get introduced. Reducing the decision time for how you direct planes. And here you see guys who are engaged in that. On the left there, you see somebody speaking into a wireless radio set. He's talking to an airplane. The other one with the telephone is talking to another air traffic control facility. They would pass on information about planes coming in or out of their sectors. It was a highly stressful operation. It was definitely what you could call essential work. Controllers were really proud of the work they were doing then. They kind of viewed it as heroic and of their work as every bit as important as that of pilots to getting people safely to their destinations. But they were not appreciated. They were not paid well. They were often engaged in forced overtime. Yet the military background of most of them, and here you see Naval Air Station controllers. Around that time, people would get out of the military and get hired by the government after having been trained to move air traffic, usually for the Air Force or the Navy. They were working, as I said, with horrible equipment. Here you see a cartoon of somebody returning from work after a stressful day of moving air traffic, really sort of unable to adjust to getting home, as his wife says, have a busy day, dear. Another cartoon sort of making fun of the fact that controllers had a hard time getting their heads out of the job at the end of a stressful day. By the way, they're developed around air traffic control a kind of a unique culture. Air traffic controllers worked rotating shifts, so they would be on a day shift for a week or two. They would shift to an evening shift, and then some would do an overnight shift. So they were constantly in rotation in and out of this work and unable to really successfully leave it behind at the end of the day. They were working with some terrible technology at that time, as I said, and a lot of the cartoons that existed in controllers magazines at the time sort of expressed the frustration about that technology. But again, they worked for the federal government. They worked in a setting where complaining was just not tolerated, really, and they had no negotiating power when it came to their dealings with the government. What happened to take these frustrated workers and turn them into unionists was it first took a tremendous tragedy, one that you could have seen coming for a while. If you understood what was happening in the growing amount of traffic, the stress controllers were on, the terrible equipment, and all of that literally came together on December 16th, 1960, when two planes collided over New York City. One crashed into Staten Island, the other landed in the streets of Park Slope, Brooklyn. Over 130 people died in this collision, including some people on the ground in Brooklyn who were hit by the falling plane there. That terrible tragedy really galvanized the controllers and made them think they had to do something about their working conditions. They were really motivated to do that when they saw what happened in the investigation that was conducted by their agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, after the mid-air collision, which basically covered up the problems the controllers knew very well were part of what led to it: the bad equipment, the overstressed workers, etc. Some of the controllers attended the inquest, which was held in public at a hotel in Brooklyn, and they were so angry about watching the FAA engage in a cover-up of what had occurred that they started to think that they needed to organize. It was exactly at that time that the federal government was undergoing a shift. And this happened with the election of John Kennedy. He'd been elected just a month before that mid-air collision in 1960. He'd come into office in 1961, having promised the labor movement that he would do something to expand union rights for federal workers. And in fact, he was good to his word. In January of 1962, he signed an executive order. It allowed federal workers to begin to organize unions and engage in limited collective bargaining. When I say limited, they were not allowed to bargain over their wages or their benefits. Those had to be determined by Congress. The order said, we can't negotiate with you about those things. But there was an opening to be able to negotiate about other aspects of the job. That proved crucial, both that the opening existed and also that there was a limitation placed on what collective bargaining could do for these workers. But air traffic controllers saw an opening with the Kennedy order. And in that very facility of Hangar 11 in then Idlewild Airport, the controllers who'd been working that day of the mid-air collision started to form a nucleus of workers who wanted to build a union. Two key guys emerged from that. Both of them were sons of mothers who were unionists. Both of them were military veterans themselves. Both of them were strong believers in the idea of building a union. One was Mike Rock on the left, the other Jack Maher. And those two guys became the sort of organizing nucleus of what would eventually emerge to be known as PATCO. But PATCO didn't get created overnight. It took several years of fits and starts of trying to organize before PATCO as an organization developed. Controllers first turned to a group called the Air Traffic Control Association to see if that group could help achieve better conditions for them. But that association included not only rank and file controllers, but also their supervisors. And you could imagine that was not a very effective vehicle for complaining to FAA management. That failed. They then turned to a broad public sector union, an independent union known as the National Association of Government Employees. It was based in Boston. Actually, in recent years, it's become part of SEIU. But back then, it was a standalone union that tried to organize all kinds of different government workers. But the guys found that neither of these organizations really got the special issues of air traffic controllers. Here's a cartoon lampooning the ACTA, the Air Traffic Control Association. The union decided it had to go in a different direction, Rock Maher and the others. Now, let me step back and just say what was going on with the Teamsters around this time. This was also an important moment in Teamster history, just as PATCO was heading toward being born, because it was in 1964, of course, that the Teamsters won their huge breakthrough of a national master freight agreement, which lifted the floor for truck drivers around the country in a way that was really profound. That was done in a context of federal regulation being pretty strong in the trucking industry at that time, and it was possible to build this kind of national master freight agreement in that context. As I'll talk about later, what would happen in the 70s and after would undermine both the Teamsters' effort to build that big master freight agreement and would undermine the organization that PATCO would become as well. And that would be the movement toward deregulation at the end of the 70s. In any case, the New York controllers started to head toward the idea that they needed a controllers organization, not one that included their bosses, not one that included other workers, but one focused on the issues of air traffic controllers. Again, it was the people in New York who spearheaded this movement. Here is Mike Rock at an organizing meeting around 1967. They solicited the help of some celebrities at that time. There was a guy named Arthur Godfrey who had a famous talent show on TV in those years, and he's pictured here. He lent his name to support the controllers' effort. Here is Jack Maher with another one of those organizers named Stan Gordon. One of the celebrities they ended up recruiting proved especially important to them, and this was the trial lawyer F. Lee Bailey. You may remember, if you were alive and around at the time, the role he played in the O.J. Simpson trial, for example. He was one of Simpson's counsels in the 1990s. In the 1960s, he was a really famous trial lawyer. He was also a veteran of the Marine Corps, a jet pilot himself. He used to fly around his own Learjet, and it was actually talking to air traffic controllers as they directed him that he became aware of some of the issues they were dealing with. Rock actually said, "Will you help us form a union?" Bailey said, "Sure, I will." And he started flying them around on his Learjet, the organizers, to different facilities around the country where they started to do their organizing. On January 11th of 1968, the union had its first founding meeting in New York City. 1968 is a crucial year in so many ways, but in one way including the assassination of Martin Luther King, for example, Lyndon Johnson's withdrawal from running for the presidency, so many other things. One thing that was not widely noticed at the time that also happened in '68 was the formation of this air traffic controllers union, organizing controllers like this one, like those pictured there. One of the things that the air traffic controllers found was that, again, kind of going back to what we were saying about UPS and the Teamsters, unless you have leverage in dealing with a boss, it's hard to get them to negotiate in a fair way with you. And controllers found that as soon as they formed their organization, the FAA basically was saying, "We don't want to deal with you. We don't want to negotiate with you about anything." And PATCO organizers decided that they needed to form an effort to pressure the FAA. So they engaged in 1968 in a work to rule action. That is, they just used the FAA's own rule book about how you move air traffic on the theory that if you actually followed all of their rules, that it would snarl up the system, it would slow down traffic. And indeed, controllers had found lots of ways to improve on that rule book in their daily operations. They decided to work to rule, and that led to an enormous stack up in 1968. The controllers called this Operation Air Safety. They said, "We're going to operate by the rule book to show you how broken the system is." And here you see a huge stack up at JFK Airport during that operation. Well, that got the FAA's attention. And they were invited to Washington to engage in the first negotiation with the FAA because they had shown that they had some workplace power. Still, they were not able to get anywhere with the FAA on some key issues. And not only that, the FAA decided to push back on this organization by targeting some of its local leaders, transferring them to places where they didn't want to go, and trying to break up the union leadership in that way. The union decided to push back against that in 1970 by engaging in a sick-out. They didn't have a right to strike, right? They're federal workers, and when they became federal employees, they had to sign a pledge that's saying they knew they don't have a right to strike. that was reinforced in Kennedy's executive order. So they decided to stage a sick out, and more than 3,000 of them did that in March of 1970. And it was that event that actually led to the horse being adopted as the logo. The people who engaged in the sick out in 1970 were thereafter known in the union as the horses. The people who brought the fight to the FAA, showed the FAA that PATCO couldn't be pushed around. The 1970 sick out was really crucial in that union's history. Again, workers showed collective action can get results. In fact, it did get results. Several things flowed from that. The FAA first tried to fire about 100 people who were involved in that sick out that it identified as organizers of it, but it eventually backed away from that and hired all but one of them back through backroom negotiations that happened between the union and the federal government. Negotiations that were led by a new president that came in to PATCO in 1970. His name was John Layden. He was also somebody who worked in that New York facility, which provided the great strength for the union in those years. Layden came in to the union in 1970 and led it through a period of consolidation that eventually led to its recognition by the federal government. A lot of that had to be accomplished by intense lobbying because PATCO was a group of federal workers. They focused first on trying to lobby politicians to get them to support the union's demands. And here you see Layden on the left meeting with a very important congressman at that time, Thaddeus Dulski, who was part of the transportation committee on the Congress, and getting him to support some of PATCO's demands for improvements. The controllers also began to deal with the administration of Richard Nixon. And indeed, Nixon okayed his aide, Charles Colson, to negotiate with PATCO over the rehiring of some of the controllers that the government tried to fire as a result of the 1970 sick out. And they were rehired in return for some favors that the union would do for Nixon. One thing was that PATCO began to make an alliance with another union, the Union of Maritime Engineers, the Maritime Engineers Beneficial Association, which was then led by the man on the right there. His name was Jesse Calhoun. Here you see him pictured with Lane Kirkland, who would become the AFL-CIO president by the end of the 70s, but at that time he was Secretary Treasurer of the AFL. By affiliating PATCO with Calhoun's union, Calhoun worked with the Nixon administration. He helped secure the rehiring of the controllers. And in return, Calhoun's union endorsed Nixon in his reelection bid in 1972. Here you see Calhoun meeting with Nixon in the White House around that time. Nixon wanted some labor support when he ran for reelection. And then basically the unions cut a deal, and PATCO and MEBA, as it was known, supported Nixon in return for bringing the controllers back on board. Now, that would plant an important historical memory in the controllers' minds about their ability to stand up to government and to still get what they wanted from a confrontation. When the controllers engaged in that sick out in 1970, it was illegal. When they were fired, the government was within its rights to fire them. They were not supposed to engage in collective action. Yet the union emerged from it basically unscathed, and with basically nobody fired for having done that. And the lesson that PATCO learned is if we stick together, we can challenge the government if need be, and even prevail. And indeed, that's basically the story that was being written, it seemed, in the early 70s. Here you see Layden in the middle with Nixon, in 1972 with, on the right there, Poli's second in command in the Union, or Layden's second in the command in the Union. His name was Robert Poli. Now, he would later become important in 1981 for reasons I'll explain in a few minutes. This backroom deal making basically laid the basis for the Union's recognition formally by the FAA in 1973, and they began to negotiate contracts for the first time with the federal government. Here you see Poli and Layden celebrating the Union's victory and its recognition in 1973. And between 1973 and 77, the Union was actually doing pretty well. It negotiated some good contracts. It used its political relationships to engage in negotiations of those contracts. Here you see Senator Ted Stevens meeting with a PATCO representative, Governor Nelson Rockefeller, Republican governor of New York at the time, meeting with PATCO people. PATCO had a very active political action committee that helped to nourish these relationships with its political friends. They negotiated a really good contract in 1974, which improved a lot of the working conditions that they were dealing with. Again, they weren't able to negotiate over pay or benefits. No federal workers were, but they negotiated over some other things that were quite meaningful for them. One thing about the Union in those years, though, and it's really evident in this picture, is its leadership was not at all diverse. As you can see here, all but one person is male. They're all white. The woman in the picture was their secretary. This is their negotiating team in 1974. The Union would start to become more diverse over time, but more about that later. The Union, though, really chafed at not being able to negotiate over pay. And so when it came time to negotiate again in 1976, it tried to use a backdoor way of negotiating over controllers' pay. That is, to seek the FAA to reclassify the positions that controllers were in. As you probably know about the federal service, there's a GS scale, the general service, GS level 12, 13, etc. Each level produced a different pay scale. Controllers could range anywhere from GS 7 to GS 13, and they used the system to try to increase or raise up their classification levels. But even to win that, they found they had to engage in some collective action to do it. The controllers by 1976 formed an internal group that called themselves the Warlocks. This was a belt buckle that was popular among some of them. And what they were the local activists who organized small job actions of slowdowns and other things to try to bring pressure to accomplish that reclassification. Again, it worked fairly well. In 1977, they made some breakthroughs. However, in the later part of the 1970s, the controllers' ability to negotiate successfully with the federal government started to collapse. This happened actually, ironically, with the election of a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, in 1976. When the Carter administration came in 1977, it was really worried about inflation. And so it fought to try to keep federal pay increases down. So budget fights began to emerge increasingly over federal pay. And the union and the air traffic controllers really felt they were not keeping up with inflation as we reached the end of the 70s. Now we're starting to see kind of late 70s level inflation in recent times. So you can imagine the impact that would start to have. Budget fights emerged. Then another crucial air disaster happened. In the skies over San Diego in 1978, again, a mid-air collision led to the FAA revoking a program that had been in place called the Immunity Program that had allowed controllers, if they had engaged in what was called a confliction, where they had directed two planes too close together As long as they reported what happened, they would not be penalized. And those reports would be used to try to fix the problems that had led to that near collision. The San Diego crash, and here you can see a plane after it had been run into by a small private plane coming down, Pacific Airlines Flight 182, everybody on board died in that collision, led the FAA to revoke that program and made controllers feel like they were now vulnerable to discipline. And that furthermore, this would make the system less safe because people wouldn't want to report some of its problems. Here's the wreckage from PSA Flight 182. And then came the other thing that worsened matters for controllers at the end of the 70s. That was this wave of deregulation that started to happen, that has been so important in shaping our economy, I think in some negative ways in the years since then. Deregulation hit both the airline and the trucking industry almost simultaneously. Again, in the Carter years. In 1978, on the left, you see Carter signing the Airline Deregulation Act. On the right is a report on the trucking deregulation that was also signed into law in 1980. In both the airline and the trucking industries, deregulation dramatically ramped up competition and created a downward pressure on workers' wages and working conditions as their employers were competing against each other. This would have, over the long haul, a definite negative impact on the Teamsters, and you would start to see the shrinking down of the National Master Freight Agreement in the years after 1980, as lots of independent trucking firms entered the fray who were non-union and tried to undercut the unionized firms. Without a regulatory floor below the trucking industry, that competition worsened. The same thing was happening in the airlines. What happened after 1978 in the airlines was that the airline industry began to reorganize toward what we know today as the hub and spoke system. To become more competitive, airlines started to focus in on certain places that would become their hubs. And to construct the system around a set of hubs. But what that meant was that if you were controlling traffic in one of those hubs, traffic was dramatically increasing in the late 70s in those hubs, in places like O'Hare Airport in Chicago, for example, or in the New York City area, Atlanta, and other key places. It put more pressure on air traffic controllers at work than they had had before. This was all happening at a time when the air traffic controller workforce itself was changing. It was seeing an influx of military people who'd served in the Vietnam era. A lot of them were leaving the military very disenchanted with what they'd experienced in Vietnam. Also having learned to distrust authority and not really willing to tolerate the kind of top-down hierarchical culture that still dominated the AFA or the FAA. African Americans and women were also increasingly coming into the workforce as well. You could see it in the way controllers looked by the end of the 70s. Here is a controller named Paul Fullenwilder or Wider in Ponce, Puerto Rico in 1980, wearing a beard, wearing a colored shirt. None of those things would have been tolerated back in 1960 in the air traffic control facilities, where controllers were mandated to wear white shirts to keep their hair short. Even beards and mustaches were prohibited at that time. It was a kind of a military culture then that had started to break down. And people like Fullenwider here were more willing to challenge the authority that they saw within the FAA in the end of the 70s. That was true also of people like Dominic Torchia. He became an important union leader in the Bay Area in the late 1970s, and he was really a product of the 60s generation and culture. And again, the whole idea of question authority was a culture they grew up in. This was also true of many of the African-American workers who had started to come into the FAA in the late 60s and early 70s, like Richard Jones, here pictured at Washington Center. Now, to get jobs in the FAA in the late 60s and early 70s for African-Americans was not easy because it was such an overwhelmingly white workforce at its founding in the early 60s. And to become an air traffic controller fully trained, you had to have senior controllers help you in your training. And what the Black controllers found was that a lot of the senior white controllers were not helping them. And so actually Rick Jones in his apartment in suburban Maryland, he used to work at what was called Washington Center, a facility just outside of Washington. He set up a mock training facility that he would have young African-American controllers come to his home, and they would have sessions to train the young controllers to help make their way in the FAA. The FAA started to diversify over the course of the 70s, thanks to controllers like Rick. Women were also breaking in at that time as well. Women like Sue Mostert, pictured below, and her friend Jackie Smith. They were breaking into an all-male environment where there was a lot of sexism and, quite frankly, sexual harassment, and they had to struggle with that. So the union was beginning to change, become more diverse, become undergoing a generational change, and it was happening at a time when the whole system was increasingly under stress. And it was at that time that within the union, everybody began to look toward what would be the next negotiation of the union with the FAA. It was scheduled to happen in 1981. And by 1980, or by 1979, actually, there started to emerge within the movement, within the union, an idea that mainly came from the younger controllers. We need to be ready even to engage in a strike if we have to in 1981. They formed a group within the union that became known as the Choir Boys. They were basically people who would educate the members and prepare them for a possible strike, knowing that it would be illegal, but coming up with a plan that felt like if we get most of the controllers to strike, there's no way they can operate the system without us. And just as happened in 1970 with the sick out, they might try to fire us, but they're going to have to deal with us, and in the end even rehire us. The system won't work without us. That was the message of the Choir Boys. And pins like this started to be worn by controllers by 1980. You see a kind of a mad dog breaking loose from its chain and ripping apart the FAA contract, and on the button it says "now." Controllers wanted action going into 1981. They didn't want the same old stuff that they've been getting, especially from the Carter administration. They were disgusted with Carter's FAA, which they thought did not listen to them at all. It was exactly at this time that that within the union's leadership, a kind of coup d'etat took place, in which the number 2 in the union, Robert Poli, who was more closely allied with the Choir Boys, basically ousted John Layden, the president who'd been elected in 1970 and led the union through its consolidation. With the union now having a new leader in Poli, one that was more in sync with the militant part of the union, and himself ready to call a strike if need be in 1981. That's how the union began planning for a showdown with the federal government in 1981. And strike planning in a serious way began. People wearing pins like this. It's a clenched fist holding the headset the controllers wore. I'm ready to strike if we have to in 81, in other words. And so controllers got ready. They knew that it would be, quite a titanic battle, as indicated in this T-shirt logo that was popular among strikers in 1981, where you see a mouse basically giving the finger to an eagle swooping down to attack it. The last great act of defiance. Controllers were ready for it. They were tired of the treatment they'd gotten. And if it took a strike to change that, they were ready to go. And Robert Poli, pictured here, was ready to lead them. Before it got to that, though, the union made an effort to basically try to elect a more favorable boss to negotiate with. In 1980, they actually endorsed Ronald Reagan for the presidency against Jimmy Carter. For them, it was, they knew the devil that Carter's administration was, and they thought, well, it's got to be better with Reagan. And Reagan actually wrote them a letter that said, I will take your concerns seriously if you support me. They took that letter as a promise that when they engaged in negotiations with him, if he became president, that he would listen to them. And so indeed, that was their bet. In 1980, they bet on Reagan. He was elected. And think about it for a second about what that would do within the union. They knew they'd endorse this guy. And they went into the 1981 negotiation thinking, okay, our guy won. We were one of the very few unions who supported Ronald Reagan in 1980. The Teamsters also did. But they believe that we're going to have an influence with this administration. However, they found that the negotiations that they engaged in the spring of 1981 fell far short of what they wanted. They staged a strike date for June 22nd, 1981. And if the negotiations didn't achieve what they wanted by that time, they were ready to call a strike. But they also set an internal union goal. 80% of our members have to be willing to go out if we're going to be successful, they judged. If 80% come out, there's no way they can break this strike, even if they try to fire us. But when they took their strike vote on the night of June 22, they fell just short of getting the 80% they wanted. And here you see Robert Poli coming out the next day, having failed to get that number on that night. They did agree to an agreement with the FAA to have a tentative agreement. Actually, in some ways, it was even though it was short of what controllers wanted, really path-breaking. Much more was accomplished in that agreement than in any previous federal agreement with a union. For one thing, the government actually found a way to raise their wages, though kind of disguising it as a way of paying them for training and lunchtime that actually no other federal workers had been able to win to that point. It was still far below what controllers hoped to get, though. And so unable to get the strike numbers they wanted on that night, Poli brought this tentative agreement to the union's leaders. They looked at it and they said, we can do better than this. Let's hold another strike vote. Let's set another strike date. And so they did. They set a new date of August 3rd, 1981. And they demanded the federal government come back to the bargaining table. They actually threw out at that point the initial goal they had that they would only strike if 80% of the members voted for it. And they believe that, okay, if we get like 75, that's good enough, we'll be able to do it. And that's about what they got on the night of August 2nd. About 75% of controllers said, yeah, we're ready to strike. On the morning of August 3rd, 1981, that's exactly what they did. Here are controllers going on strike at Miami, out on the West Coast. And within hours of that walkout beginning, President Reagan made an ultimatum to the union. He walked into the Rose Garden that morning at 11 o'clock. Here you see him pictured with his Attorney General, William French Smith, and he made a statement about the strike that I'll play for you here.
This morning at 7 a.m., the union representing those who man America's air traffic control facilities called a strike. This was the culmination of 7 months of negotiations between the Federal Aviation Administration and the union. At one point in these negotiations, agreement was reached and signed by both sides, granting a $40 million increase in salaries and benefits. This is twice what other government employees can expect. It was granted in recognition of the difficulties inherent in the work these people perform. Now, however, the union demands are 17 times what had been agreed to, $681 million. This would impose a tax burden on their fellow citizens which is unacceptable. I would like to thank the supervisors and controllers who are on the job today helping to get the nation's air system operating safely. In the New York area, for example, 4 supervisors were scheduled to report for work and 17 additionally volunteered. At National Airport, a traffic controller told a news person he had resigned from the union and reported to work because, quote, "How can I ask my kids to obey the law if I don't?" End quote. This is a great tribute to America. Let me make one thing plain. I respect the right of workers in the private sector to strike. Indeed, as president of my own union, I led the first strike ever called by that union. I guess I'm maybe the first one to ever hold this office who is a lifetime member of an AFL-CIO union. But we cannot compare labor management relations in the private sector with government. Government cannot close down the assembly line. It has to provide without interruption the protective services which are government's reason for being. It was in recognition of this that the Congress passed a law forbidding strikes by government employees against the public safety. Let me read the solemn oath taken by each of these employees, the sworn affidavit when they accepted their jobs. I am not participating in any strike against the government of the United States or any agency thereof, and I will not so participate while an employee of the government of the United States or any agency thereof. It is for this reason that I must tell those who fail to report for duty this morning they are in violation of the law, and if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
That statement was heard around the world, really. And it was one of the most powerful efforts to break a strike that Americans had seen. And again, air traffic controllers didn't have a right to strike legally, but they felt morally they did. And they believed that if they stuck together, they would win. I interviewed a lot of controllers and asked them, how did you feel when you watched that? Because a lot of them watched it live at the time. And they pretty much said, you know, we felt sorry for Reagan because we felt like there's no way he's going to be able to accomplish this, that he'll be able to fire us and still make the system work without us. They really believed that if they stuck together, they would force him to back down. And though he threatened to terminate them, as he said, that in the end, the government would have to deal with them, just as Nixon's administration dealt with the sick out in 1970. They bet wrong, as we know. They were fired, they were defeated, and the defeat was huge in its implications. For one thing, the public largely supported Reagan, and he wouldn't have been able to accomplish this if not for that. For many in the public, they didn't understand the nature of the work. The controllers had spent very little time trying to engage in public education about the importance of their job. A lot of people didn't even know that there were air traffic controllers. They thought pilots just directed their own flights. There was not a lot of pre-work done to get the public behind the strike. And so Reagan basically claimed the stage, condemned the strikers, had public support to do it, and broke their strike. He did it by having supervisors work in many of these air traffic control facilities during the strike, by bringing in military people to run air traffic, as many were brought into different sections of the country. Now, the labor movement rallied behind PATCO, and here you see that there was a march on Washington on September 19th, 1981. Solidarity Day, it was called, and PATCO was given a privileged place in that protest against Reagan's policies, as you see here, getting ready to march that day. But there was not enough ability of the labor movement or public opinion to be able to change Reagan's course of action. Lots of rallies were held for PATCO by union people around the country, as union people would come together to support others in a strike, even an unpopular one. And yet the defeat occurred. The defeat left huge amount of fallout. Here are some PATCO strikers in 1981. I want to explore a few of the after effects now. One thing, interestingly enough, is that the strike actually was good for our air traffic control system in the long run, and for air traffic controllers. The ones who were fired never regained their jobs for the most part. Clinton removed the ban on their firing, and some were hired back in the 90s. But for the most part, a new controller workforce had to be recruited in the early 80s. And one of the things that the newly hired controllers found was that the FAA treated them a lot better than it had ever treated PATCO controllers. They got much better pay. There was more accelerated diversity hiring in this period. A new union came in, which remains there to that day. The newly hired controllers formed the National Air Traffic Control Association in 1987. And in fact, the government adopted special rules that apply to air traffic controllers to this day. They get to negotiate over things that other federal workers don't, out of recognition that that keeping them happy is really important. Nobody wants a replication of what happened in 1987. So to this day, that's a much improved job for the people who do it now, thanks to the fight that controllers made in the 80s. While it wasn't so bad for air traffic controllers who followed the strikers, it was devastating, though, for the rest of the labor movement. Never had there been a strike so widely watched that took place everywhere, from Guam to Puerto Rico, from Alaska to Key West. Every place there was an airport, people saw this strike broken. People watched it happen in real time. And it had a devastating psychological impact on workers and the labor movement. One of the things that it did is it helped to give permission to private sector employers to do something that very few of them had been doing up to that point in time, even though they had a right to do it since 1938. In 1938, the Supreme Court issued a ruling called National Labor Relations Board versus McKay Radio and Telegraph. In that decision, the board said that in the case of an economic strike in the private sector of workers covered by the National Labor Relations Act, if workers were striking over their pay and benefits, then employers had a right to hire replacement workers. They couldn't do that if they were, engaged in an unfair labor practice strike. But otherwise, if it was a strike about economic issues, employers were free to hire replacements. And indeed, that freedom had been on the books since 1938. In the post-World War II years, not so many employers took advantage of that freedom, though. But in the 1980s, they certainly did, because they had seen Ronald Reagan break PATCO, permanently replace the air traffic controllers, and not suffer much in public opinion for it at all. That strengthened the outlook of many corporate executives who said, let's do the same. In the federal sector, Reagan could fire them because striking was illegal. But in the private sector, we can hire replacements. And it's going to work just as well. And indeed, that's what began to happen. This was a kind of a prediction of it that was in a pamphlet that came out right after the PATCO strike. If the blasts don't get you, then the fallout will. Reagan had had nuked PATCO in effect, but other unions were next on the list, including in the middle there, the IBT, the Teamsters, that were going to suffer as a result. In the 1980s, in the aftermath of the PATCO strike, strike after strike in the private sector was broken when workers went out on strike and employers, instead of negotiating with them, basically just hired replacements to break the strike. That happened when Phelps Dodge's copper miners went on strike in Arizona in 1983. It happened when Greyhound bus drivers went on strike in 1983. It happened when Hormel's meat packers went on strike in Minnesota in 1986. It happened when international paper workers went on strike in Jay, Maine and other settings in 1987. Strike after strike in the 1980s saw employers simply hire replacement workers. And to do this following in effect on Reagan's example, even though the private sector was under different rules, of course. As those strikes were broken, one after another, labor leaders and workers as well saw all of this, and it had a dramatic impact on workers' willingness to engage in a strike. If we go out on strike, then they're just going to replace us. And in fact, that was probably the most lasting legacy of the PATCO effort. One of the ways in which it lived on. PATCO had a bumper sticker of strikers later that they'd put on their cars saying "PATCO lives," or wearing buttons saying "it ain't over yet." They still hope to get their jobs back years later. The way in which the strike truly did live on, though, was as a deterrent to other strikes as began to happen. Now, over the long history of the labor movement, the strike has been the most important basic weapon that workers have. That was true back in 1836 when the Lowell mill women went on strike. It was true at the turn of the last century when sweatshop workers would engage in strikes. It was true in the 1930s when auto workers sat down and occupied the auto plants in Flint, Michigan. It was true in 1968 when another illegal strike happened. Memphis sanitation workers went out on strike and eventually won a union. It was, of course, in defense of that strike that Martin Luther King went to Memphis, where he was assassinated. Strikes were crucial for workers as a point of leverage. And yet what began to happen in the post-PATCO era, as you see in this graph, is that the number of strikes that were large strikes just began to plummet as workers became concerned about whether they could go on strike. Not only did strikes begin to plummet, but union density began to decline further, and it had been in decline since before the PATCO era. One thing you can see here in the green line is there was a shooting up of the number of government workers that were forming unions at the end of the 70s. After the PATCO strike, basically that rising tide of public sector unionization basically hit a ceiling, and it's never been as high again, and it's started to erode in the years since. In the private sector, as we've seen, unionization has continued to decline. It's down around 6% now, as you all know. The total unionization of the country is just about 10% now. Workers continue to suffer from the loss of the leverage of the strike that they began to lose in the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 80s. Now, Teamsters pushed back against that. They did that in 1997, as I said at the beginning, in the big walkout they staged against UPS then. Nearly 200,000 workers went on strike for 15 days. It was the biggest strike since PATCO, and it was successful. Many people hoped that that strike would turn around the tide for the labor movement in general after 1997. For the most part, though, that didn't happen. And you can see again the number of workers involved in work stoppages continued to decline after the Teamsters. You can see this is the Teamsters. They alone are responsible for that big jump right there. But, you know, workers really haven't recovered much in the years since, except you can see in this blip here, just before 1920. Which you see in a bigger blow up here. What was behind that? That was a public sector movement. You might remember the teachers engaging in the Red for Ed strikes in 2018. That led to a huge surge in strikes. And many people hoped that that would translate out of the public sector into the private sector. In recent years, there have been some big strikes. There was one in December, as you might have followed, at the University of California. There were strikes in 2021 and what many people called Striketober, if you remember that, including the John Deere strike. And we're living through a strike right now that you've been watching in the news, the Writers Guild strike. Important strikes, but strikes, you know, that aren't of the level and the size and the importance, I would say, as the one that now perhaps looms on the horizon if UPS doesn't come through in this negotiation with the Teamsters. The negotiation going on right now is crucial to the future, not only of the Teamsters Union, but I would argue the whole labor movement. One of the things that makes it so important is that memory, that in 1997, Teamsters were able to strike successfully. And that is behind the power that the union brings to the negotiating table right now. But make no mistake that this negotiation going on right now is a historic one. And especially if it does lead to a strike, it will be one that takes place in the context of a long history from the horse of PATCO down to thunder and lightning of the Teamsters today. I think what we're witnessing now is a potential dispelling of a long and I would say sad history of workers being unable to use their power to really move the needle collectively. Teamsters are in a position to really help change history, I think, in this year. And so I hope that, you know, looking back at PATCO, its impact and the struggle to overcome it, even to this day, provides at least some historical backdrop for you. So with that, I'll stop. I'll be happy to entertain any questions or thoughts people have. Thanks.
Joe, thank you so much. Shall we open this up for some questions?
I think it's excellent what you said, Joseph, and all the history that you brought to the table. And it broke my heart when that strike with Reagan, how he broke those traffic controllers. And we do have some in my local.
Mm-hmm.
We call them radio controllers.
Right.
And when we negotiate, we have to negotiate on behalf of, you know, different parts of the union represent other parts, you know. So when we sit down and we negotiate with them, you know, it's hard, you know, yeah. You're battling because you can't pull them out in the street.
Right.
You know, which is really sad, you know, you lose your negotiating power, you know.
Right.
It's really, really sad.
Well, as you have heard, I'm sure that many people have said that in the public sector, if you don't have the right to strike, then it's not collective bargaining, it's collective begging. It is, you know, the loss of that leverage, you know, can be quite damaging. However, as I'm sure you've found in your negotiations, and as teachers have demonstrated, that solidarity can overcome a lot of that. even if you're not able to actually strike. But yeah, for sure.
So I have a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut off Eric if he was going to say something. Do you feel, I feel that in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, people had this fire in their belly and went in the street to fight for what they thought was right. Do you think this is starting to make a turn now in this decade going forward?
Well, I think that that is yet to be determined, and really, again, I do think that something like what the Teamsters is doing right now can help to shape the answer to that question. One thing about workers engaging in collective actions like strikes is that they're part of a collective memory. And when people haven't been part of or seen a big strike before, it's hard for them to imagine that they can actually engage in something like that and win with it. You know, successful strikes breed successful strikes. Successful efforts of solidarity and collective action encourage other people to engage in it. And by the same token, big defeats can encourage or discourage people from engaging in stuff. So I do think what we've seen in recent years, though, Anthony, is more and more workers who are dissatisfied with the current state of things and want to find ways to push back against it. And so I think a more fertile ground exists now than has in a long time for trying to make advances and to have workers come together with that fire in their belly. And when I watch, you know, footage I've seen of Teamster rallies and things around the contract negotiation, I feel that enthusiasm there. I feel like your members are feeling it, and also having a sense of their historic role. Like they're fighting not just for themselves, I think, but for a broad swath of American workers, because if they can move the needle, then they can encourage other workers to do it.
And there's one other thing I'd just like to say. I represent the largest market in the world, which is the Hunts Point market. And we took our members, which we represent close to roughly about 1,600 members. And we took them out on strike.
Wow.
And, we successfully won. But what we did is we got council involved, meaning, you know, the Bronx Borough, Queens. Yeah. We went to the community, but more importantly, we got involved in social media, which I'm really not a big social media fan, maybe because of my age, but they helped us the most to make it nationwide. And that really helped us the best, because not only in the market that we represent, the rail comes in there.
Yes.
Not only the rail, but most of the food that comes in and the vegetables comes from a mass part of California. So we were able to use media and people that lived in the community to help us even more. And it just went so viral on social media that we were having people buy food. We didn't even have to fund the strike with food, because people were just sending food to us. And I think these younger crowds now that are my kids' age, in their 30s, are starting to get this fire in their belly that say, hey, like, you know, Starbucks, some portions of Amazon, that people are saying, listen, we don't, you know, we're not going to deal with this anymore. And we're going to stand up and try to, you know, help other locals or other organizations to try to do what's right and get a fair and decent contract.
Well, that's so important. And the work that you did in laying the groundwork for that strike, I think, was so crucial. And your use of communication to get your message out. I think if you look back at what happened to PATCO, it's sort of a textbook case of how not to engage in a major conflict like that. They didn't build a lot of solidarity in advance of the strike. They never, for example, even talked to the pilots union before they went out. The pilots didn't end up supporting them. And that was crucial. They didn't engage in the kind of solidarity building. They did not engage in, you talked about reaching out to community members. They didn't really reach out to the public to say, hey, one of the reasons why we're doing this is that, you know, the jobs that we're working on are so stressful that, you know, mistakes can prove fatal. And we're trying to improve those jobs for everybody's benefit. They didn't really do much of that. Actually, in recent years, public sector unions, I think, have really gotten this message in a powerful way, especially teachers' unions, I would say. Don't go on strike without having the public already in your corner. Don't go on strike without reaching out to parent groups, without reaching out to the community to engage in an effort that is one that they have a stake in. I work with a lot of unions now that engage in what we call bargaining for the common good. And the idea behind that comes out of, well, like if you've watched what the Chicago teachers did in 2012 and some subsequent strikes and some other teachers unions, where the union actually went into negotiation, not only demanding wage and benefit things, but making demands on behalf of the community to improve the schools and to do it in alliance with the community. That kind of approach is a winning approach. I think one of the lessons of PATCO is don't do it the way they did it. Because they made it actually very easy for Ronald Reagan to go into the Rose Garden and to give the speech he did. And they didn't prepare the public at all to look at it in a different way. And in a sense, they did rely on the idea they'll never be able to replace us. And they thought that was their ace in the hole. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but I think what your strike shows, Anthony, is that there are ways to engage in the building process of an effort that ensures that it will succeed.
One of the things that we did with our history books was we've done a series of different topics, and one book we did was on the 1991 newspaper strike in Pittsburgh. And that was another one of those strikes where it was very successful. It was a model almost for how to do a strike. Unfortunately, the following couple of years, Detroit newspaper also went on strike. And I think that the newspaper owners learned from the mistakes that the Pittsburgh newspaper owners made, and the Detroit strike was not successful, but the Pittsburgh strike was, and they really had the community engaged and the media engaged, and it was very interesting.
Absolutely. The community is crucial. And to your earlier question, Anthony, about this moment, like right now, and you were referring to young people, unions have a higher favorability rating than they've had since the early 60s, and especially among young people. So that, I think, is a moment or something to draw a lot of hope from in this moment.
Joe, if I could ask you a historical question that centers on the importance of what Reagan did. So when I teach this, I have my slides on PATCO. I have a cover of your book on those slides. I quote you. And so my line is your line, which is Reagan's decision to break this strike struck a decisive blow. It sent a clear signal to businesses across the land that if federal government could declare open season on a union, so could they. And so the moral impact or the immoral impact of what he did is absolutely significant. Now comes the however or the but. And the question becomes, how much weight to place on that. So if I recall your graph correctly, the strike lines begins to decline before Reagan. And then it kind of flatlines, from the 1980s onward. And as you have written elsewhere, a lot else is going on. So there's, the deindustrialization phenomenon that guts so much basic industry. There's the rise of anti-union firms, union avoidance law firms and consulting firms, the financialization of the economy, and in one of your pieces in particular, or at least several, the rise of, big retail. So Walmart and Amazon and then fast food. These are different kind of sectors from the kind of the heart, the center of industrial or post-industrial unionism earlier. So, counterfactual: if Reagan didn't utter the words that he did, and or if PATCO hadn't existed, how different would labor history have unfolded in the 1980s onward? So how much weight would you put on what he did, and how much can we attribute to all of these broader phenomena that transformed the very playing field on which organized labor operates?
It's a great question, an important question, and like, while I focus on the crucial psychological and moral or immoral impact of what Reagan did, clearly it would have been. Let me turn the counterfactual around. If it had not occurred at a time when the other things that you're mentioning, Eric, were also happening, deindustrialization, big, closings of some of the big unionized parts of our economy. Youngstown Sheet and Tube just, closed without warning on September 19th, 1977, just 10,000 jobs gone without warning. Without deindustrialization happening, without deregulation occurring, changing the nature of the economy, without the impact of the container ship starting to be felt by the second half of the 70s, as it made it so much easier to have things made abroad and then shipped at such a low cost into the US market. Without all of those structural things going on at the same time, what Reagan did wouldn't have had that much effect. So, but what he did happened at a moment of unique vulnerability for workers. Now, let me turn the counterfactual back to the way that you phrased it, which is, what if he didn't do that? Would have things still gone in that direction? I think, the general trend line was already down. It was heading down. It's hard to dispute that. As you say, the graphs kind of show that in the years by 1978, 79, you started to see employers were sensing the shift in the winds, and so were workers. Workers were feeling it too. And so there was already a shift undergoing at that time. If Reagan hadn't done what he did, I think, labor's trend line still would have been down in those years. But I think the impact of Reagan was political, psychological, and national in a really profound way. It's hard to imagine a strike that before that had the national attention that this one had. People never really saw something like this happen in real time, and everybody saw it. And the fact that it was so dramatic and that it was done by an actor, right? He knew how to play for the drama of it, as you could see in the Rose Garden. And the fact that he was able to say, I had been a union leader, I've led a strike. I'm not against strikes, but I'm against this strike. That he was able to do all of this, I think was really important in a kind of profound way. I think one thing that has happened since that moment, which may not have occurred, goes to that really, in the same way at least, goes to that point about Reagan as a union man. So In the years between World War II and the late 70s, support for unions in the United States was not so divided on partisan lines. I mean, I showed pictures there of like Nelson Rockefeller, Republican governor in New York, was sort of pro-union in a sense, was not anti-union at least. There were a lot of Republicans in the 1970s who considered themselves friends of labor. Including, for example, Guy Molinari. He was a congressman on Staten Island in the 80s. He tried to get Reagan to rehire controllers. He didn't like what Reagan did in banning them for life. But when Reagan threw down the gauntlet to PATCO, it really kind of created a moment in the Republican Party when it became, a lot safer to be openly anti-union.
Yes.
Reagan could lead the way in it. People like Guy Molinari started to disappear by the end of the 20th century. There aren't many anywhere in the Republican Party in the Congress today who really say, I believe in collective bargaining. I'm a strong supporter of unions. It's become so partisan. So I think one thing, Eric, that probably wouldn't have happened in the way it did is the polarization that occurred in a partisan way around collective bargaining, especially in the public sector. Scott Walker, if you all remember, in 2011, he came to power in Wisconsin. He immediately stripped bargaining power from most of the state's public employees. He cited Reagan when he did it. He said, this is our Reagan moment, and we're going to do this. I think the Scott Walker Republican Party emerged in part because of what Reagan did. And so I think that's one of the distinctive aspects. I think the other distinctive aspect is just the public witness of, the crushing of a strike. And it wasn't just the crushing of a strike that everybody saw, but these were people who, a lot of people thought you can't replace these people. And to replace them, I think, just dramatically increased the psychological impact. I do think that it created a kind of ghost, that haunted workers in the labor movement in a profound way that wouldn't have been there had Reagan not done that. So yeah, the trend line, I think, would have been down, but not so dramatic, I think, and not with such profound and kind of, rippling effects as, for example, we see, I think, in what happened to the Republican Party over time.
Thank you.
I'd just like to add something, and that was excellent what you said, Joseph. We're trying to, we've been negotiating for the last 10 years to fund and rebuild the market. The market is about 70 years old, which is actually old. And my principal officer, which is Dan Kane Jr., over the last 10 years have been trying to get the employers to get skin in the game because we're on city property. And the last person that we had there, a Democrat, Chuck Schumer, who's always been a friend to labor, came down and spoke 2 months ago. And we had on him promising us he's going to help us get money, which he has. But more importantly, for us to have the market rebuilt, these owners have to have, they have to put up money. But the best phrase that Chuck said, or the statement that Chuck Schumer said to them, he says, this market will not get built unless it is done by union labor and the Teamsters being a part of, because he's always been a friend of union, of labor, so yes, it was excellent what you said on the Republican side, but, it was just so nice to hear and see the owners that were standing in the in the press room, and their mouths turned upside down when he heard they say, if you're going to leave the union out, then I'm not going to get you a nickel, So, yes, we have to, more importantly, we have to get, Senate and Congress in on when we're trying to get things done. And more importantly, we're trying to help revitalize the community, because we are in the Bronx is one of the highest rates of asthma and the poorest congressional district over there. So more importantly, for the last 8 years, we've just been getting any kind of council person in the area to join with us, not only to hold jobs, but to revitalize the area, but more importantly, to keep the community. Because listen, I mean, in the part of the Bronx where we're at, people don't go to college. So it's a great paying job. It's a middle class job.
Right.
And we're just trying to keep the community, and like you said before, keep the community involved. And that way, hopefully, things will get better. So thank you for that.
No, that's really crucial. And, it's good to hear that Schumer came down there and made that statement. I think one of the more interesting things that's happened in the last 10 years is that within the Democratic Party, there's been more of an embrace of labor than there had been for a long time. Back in the era of Carter, for example, and one of the things that went wrong for PATCO is that they just found that this Democratic administration, they'd endorsed Carter in 1976, was more concerned about inflation and, keeping taxes low than answering some of the questions of workers at that time. And I think from the 70s through the, early 2000s, the Democratic Party sort of engaged in a kind of distancing from the labor movement. One of the, great colleagues that Eric and I had, who's now departed, Judith Stein, wrote about what happened to, the Democratic Party and the labor movement in the 70s, where like the party just kind of pulled back from the historic kind of alliance that emerged between Democrats and labor in the New Deal era. But now I think we're starting to see within the Democratic Party a kind of education process of how essential it is that there be a strong labor movement. And more Democrats, I think, are speaking out in that way. I think Joe Biden is a real example of it. We've never had a president, I think, including probably FDR, who has been more vocally pro-labor and proud to talk about that than Biden has been. Now, again, there are limits on his power and what he can do with that. And sometimes he has to disappoint unions, I think, as happened, for example, in the rail crisis. Some of the unions wanted more from that negotiation. But, for the most part, he's really tried to cultivate that alliance in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. So I think it's an important kind of recovery process that's underway.
It is. And I don't mean to cut you off, Joe, but
No, go ahead.
Biden has done a lot for the unions by saving the pensions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And, for all these locals and for unions that, their pensions were underfunded.
Yes.
He did a big thing. So, I have to take my hat off to him.
And that was a thing that a lot of people don't even know about, but so crucial. Yeah.
Very crucial. Very crucial. So I have to say he's played a big part with unions, and thank God my was self-funded. Our pension didn't fall in that, but it's just so nice. There was an article that I read several years ago pertaining to a guy that worked. He was in his late 60s and he had this set amount of money that he was looking forward to retire, and his pension was underfunded. And he was looking at a $3,000 pension, wind up to be, it would be $600. And he says, I worked all these years to get to this age to retire and live, and live like middle class.
Right.
And then, all of a sudden, and then, years later, by fighting and fighting and fighting, and it just happened to be, Thank God Trump wasn't there, because, we definitely wouldn't have got that.
Right.
But Biden, looked into that, and he did the right thing for us. And that I appreciate, so that made me happy to see that a person that worked all those years, not
Right.
saying that he's going to get that $3,000, but they got money to take care of them for the years of his loss. But going forward, he at least got something that he could live. I try to tell a lot of young people, I says, do you understand the reason why we have Social Security? That made middle class. And they look at me like, huh, what are you talking about? I'm like, no, that was what made us middle class.
Yeah.
And it's just, and thank you. The words and the class that you gave today, it means a lot. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
This was great. I really enjoyed this. And there are so many avenues that you could take from it. I think we're going to have a repeat of this,
No, they say great minds think alike. I was going to say the same thing.
yeah, this was very good.
Well, look,
I
I'm happy to talk to you or your people anytime you want. I really admire what your union does, and I love that Eric is connected to you, and
No,
even
thank
you have this series is a great thing.
Yeah, it's to Renee and to Eric, that we have this, doing this every month. But more importantly, I have to apologize. It is Mother's Day weekend. Happy Mother's Day to mothers. But we usually get a lot more people on.
That's okay.
Yeah, and I'm thinking it's because it was Saturday.
Yeah.
We usually do them on Sunday, and I do think Mother's Day has a big thing on it. So I really think that obviously we recorded it and we'll put it on our YouTube station, and we get lots of people that watch stuff on our YouTube thing. But I'm thinking that we'll need to do an encore performance of this, because this is really important, and especially for young people to understand. And one of the things that I was thinking about was that Reagan gave anti-unionists permission to speak out and become stronger. Like Jones Day moved in next door to the Teamsters Union, which cracks me up that they're right next door to us. But in the same way, Trump gave people permission to vocalize other issues that they were feeling but kept closed about. So I think we're in a very similar process with people that we battle, feeling stronger and feeling permission to act the way they are. And so I think it's very important for us to teach our young members that this has happened before. This isn't new, that we can deal with this, but here's how. So
Yes. I think you're totally right, Karen. I think the analogy between Trump and Reagan and the impact that what they did as a permission giving to broader trends is really, really important. So yeah, we're overcoming a lot. We've been through a lot as a country in recent years, but I am hopeful of the trend direction now.
yeah, me
Reasons we were
too.
just talking about.
I get really, oh my God. And then I meet some of our young people in our union, and I get energized again. I'm like, okay, it's not all terrible. They're good, and they're going to do some stuff. So I think the more that we can work with them, the better off we're going to be.
And it's funny you say that, Karen, because at the beginning, when Joseph said that his daughter got a job with the union, there's days when you feel doom and gloom, and then you hear something like that.
Yep.
It's like gives you a boost. Or
Yep.
to hear what Eric's children did. It gives you a boost and says, you know what? There is hope. There really is hope. I stood in an elevator one day and I was telling this young kid, said, oh, what do you do? Well, I work for a labor organization. She looked at me and she said, what's that?
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God. But, hearing that, like your daughter, Joseph, I wish her best in her going forward. and the things that Eric his children have done, and you know, my children that understand, you know, what labor movement is. And, you know, it's nice to see that these young people are starting to give, you know, they're giving us a breath of fresh air to, you know,
Yeah.
to carry the baton.
Although I have to say the worst experience I ever had was when a group of college kids came up to me. I was going to do a program and I had my bag and they asked me who the tea masters were.
Oh, no.
And I was like, oh my God, we're in trouble. So,
It took me a second.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Well, thank you so much.
thank you. It was really a pleasure. Great to see you all, and have a happy Mother's Day all.
all right.
Yes.
And we look forward to working with you again, Joe. It was great.
I'm here
Yes.
and I love what you do. So whenever you want.
Thank you,
Okay,
Joseph.
terrific.
And Eric, thank you for introducing, you know, Joseph and inviting him, which is a great person to have on with us. Thank you again. And
Thank
thank
you.
you everyone for taking the time.
Thank you. Have a
Good
great
night.
weekend.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.